The November gale that swept the Cornish coast that evening was, in the opinion of my friend Hercule Poirot, entirely too enthusiastic in its welcome. As our taxi lurched up the winding cliff road toward the Blackwood Hotel, Poirot clutched his traveling case with both hands and regarded the storm-lashed landscape through the window with evident disapproval. "It is barbarous, Hastings," he declared, steadying himself as we rounded another sharp curve. "The English, they invite one to take the sea air, but they neglect to mention that the sea air comes equipped with the velocity of a cannonball." I laughed, though I had to admit the weather was rather fierce. "Come now, Poirot, you said yourself that your little grey cells needed a rest from London's fog. Besides, Monsieur Gaspard was quite desperate in his letter. A ghost story at a seaside hotel. Surely that's worth investigating." "A ghost?" Poirot sniffed, adjusting his tie with precision despite the taxi's swaying. "Mon ami, I have told you before, there are no ghosts. There are only guilty consciences and overactive imaginations. Usually they amount to the same thing." The Blackwood Hotel loomed before us through the driving rain, a magnificent Victorian pile perched precariously on the cliff edge like a great stone ship riding out the storm. Its Gothic towers and elaborate stonework spoke of an age when hotels were built to impress rather than merely accommodate, and the warm yellow light streaming from its many windows promised refuge from the tempest. Monsieur Gaspard, the hotel's proprietor, greeted us in the lobby with the frantic energy of a man whose livelihood hung in the balance. He was a small, nervous Frenchman whose hands seemed to be in constant motion, wringing themselves, or adjusting his spectacles, or smoothing his thinning hair. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, Dieu merci, you have arrived safely. The roads, they are treacherous tonight, but you are here, you are here." He seized Poirot's hand and pumped it with such vigor that my friend's eyebrows rose in alarm. "Calmez-vous, mon vieux," Poirot murmured, gently extricating his fingers. "We are indeed here, and we are at your service. But first, perhaps, we might warm ourselves by your excellent fire and meet these guests who are so troubled by your supernatural visitor." The lobby was a masterpiece of Victorian grandeur, all dark oak paneling and deep leather chairs arranged around a fireplace large enough to roast an ox. Despite the storm raging outside, the atmosphere within was one of comfortable luxury, marred only by the obvious tension among the small group of guests gathered for pre-dinner drinks. "Allow me to present our company," Gaspard said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We have Lady Althea Pembroke, a most distinguished guest, though she has been vocal in her skepticism regarding our difficulties." Lady Althea was a formidable woman in her early 60s with silver hair, swept into an elaborate coiffure and diamonds that caught the firelight like captured stars. She sat in the largest chair as though it were a throne, surveying the room with the imperious gaze of one accustomed to command. When Gaspard introduced us, she extended a gloved hand with regal condescension. "So you are the famous Hercule Poirot," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of the English upper classes. "I trust you have not come here to validate this nonsense about weeping women and haunted rooms. I have little patience for theatrical superstition." "Madame," Poirot replied with a courteous bow, "I have come merely to observe and, perhaps, to understand. The supernatural, it interests me only in so far as it reveals the very natural motivations of human beings." "Precisely what I should expect from a man of sense," Lady Althea declared with satisfaction, unlike some present company who seemed determined to encourage these ridiculous tales. Her pointed glance fell upon a young man standing near the mantelpiece, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and a sardonic smile playing about his lips. This was Julian Ashford, Gaspard explained, a playwright from London who had arrived 3 days earlier and had shown an unseemly interest in the hotel's supernatural reputation. "My dear Lady Althea," Ashford said, raising his glass in a mocking salute, "surely even you must admit that the evidence is compelling. 3 guests have fled in the middle of the night this month alone, all claiming to have heard the same thing. a woman weeping in the tower room, mourning her lost child. Hysteria is contagious, Mr. Ashford, Lady Althea snapped, particularly among the impressionable and the artistic temperament. Ashford's smile widened. How fortunate, then, that you possess neither quality. The tension in the room was palpable, and I found myself studying the other guests with growing interest. There was Miss Dorothy Crane, Lady Althea's companion, a quiet woman of middle age who watched her employer with the devoted attention of a faithful spaniel. Beside the window stood Major Thornbury, a retired military man whose weathered face bore the stamp of long service in India, and near him a sleek, well-dressed gentleman whom Gaspar identified as Mr. Silas Pembroke, Lady Althea's nephew and heir. "The tower room," I said to Gaspar. "That would be your famous 13th room?" "Oui, Captain. It is at the end of the east corridor in the old tower. The room, it has a most peculiar history. Built as part of the original Smuggler's Inn, it was later the site of a tragedy. A young woman threw herself from the window during a terrible storm, much like tonight's. She had lost her child, you see, to the fever, and in her grief, she sought to join the babe in death," finished Ashford with evident relish. "Hence the weeping woman who haunts the room. Quite atmospheric, don't you think, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot studied the young man with interest. "You seem remarkably well informed about the hotel's history, monsieur." "I make it my business to understand the places that inspire me," Ashford replied. "I'm researching a new play, you see, a ghost story with a modern twist. The Blackwood provides excellent material." "How perfectly ghoulish," Lady Althea observed with distaste. "I suppose you'll have us all murdered in our beds for the sake of your theatrical ambitions." "Only metaphorically, I assure you," Ashford laughed, "though I must say the atmosphere here is wonderfully conducive to dark thoughts." It was then that Lady Althea made the announcement that would, in retrospect, seal her fate. "I have had quite enough of this nonsense," she declared, rising from her chair with majestic authority. "Monsieur Gaspard, I demand that you prepare the tower room for my use tonight. I intend to spend the entire night there and prove once and for all that your weeping woman is nothing more than wind in the chimney and old pipes in the walls." The effect of this pronouncement was electric. Gaspard went pale and began wringing his hands with renewed vigor. Miss Crane gasped and reached out as though to restrain her employer. Even Major Thornbury looked startled. "My lady," Gaspar stammered, "I beg you to reconsider. The room, it has been closed for weeks. The heating is unreliable. The electrical wiring is old. I have my furs," Lady Althea cut him off imperiously, "and I have my common sense. That is all the protection I require against your phantom." Poirot had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention of a cat watching a mouse hole. Now he stepped forward, his head tilted at that characteristic angle that indicated his interest was thoroughly aroused. "Forgive me, madame, but are you quite certain this is wise? Sometimes the atmosphere of a place, the accumulated weight of tragedy and legend, can work upon the mind in ways we do not anticipate." Lady Althea fixed him with a withering stare. "My mind, Monsieur Poirot, is a fortress. I suggest you concern yourself with your own mental faculties, which I'm told are considerable, rather than questioning mine." "Très bien," Poirot murmured with a slight bow. "Then perhaps you will permit me to examine this room before you take up residence. Professional curiosity, you understand." "Examine away," Lady Althea replied grandly. "You will find nothing more sinister than dust and neglect." After dinner, an excellent meal that Poirot pronounced worthy of his attention, we accompanied Gaspard and Lady Althea to the east corridor. The tower room stood at the end of a long, dimly lit passage, its heavy oak door bearing the number 13 in tarnished brass. Gaspard unlocked it with evident reluctance, and we stepped inside. The room was circular, built within the hotel's original tower, with tall windows that looked out over the storm-tossed sea. It was handsomely appointed, with a 4-poster bed, a fireplace, and elegant furnishings, but there was something oppressive about the atmosphere, a sense of sadness that seemed to cling to the very walls. Poirot moved about the room with his characteristic precision, examining the windows, the fireplace, the heavy curtains that stirred slightly in the draughts. He paid particular attention to the door, testing the lock and examining the bolt that could be secured from the inside. "The windows," he observed, "they open onto a sheer drop to the rocks below. No access from without. The door is solid oak, and when bolted from within, it would be quite impossible to force from the corridor." "Precisely," Lady Althea said with satisfaction. "A perfect sanctuary from both supernatural interference and human intrusion." As we prepared to leave her to her vigil, Poirot paused in the doorway. "One final question, madame, if you will permit. What exactly do you hope to prove by this demonstration?" Lady Althea's eyes glittered in the lamplight. "That fear is a luxury I cannot afford, Monsieur Poirot, and that those who traffic in superstition do so at their peril." We heard the heavy bolt slide home as she secured herself within, and Gaspard led us back down the corridor with obvious relief. "She is a brave lady," he murmured, "but perhaps not a wise one. The tower room, it has a long memory, and some memories are best left undisturbed." I slept fitfully that night, troubled by dreams of weeping women and storm-lashed towers. The wind howled around the hotel like a living thing, and more than once I woke convinced I had heard something, a cry, perhaps, or the sound of footsteps in the corridor above. Morning brought little improvement in the weather, but it did bring a discovery that would transform our peaceful ghost-hunting expedition into something far more sinister. It was Miss Crane who found her. The poor woman had gone to the tower room at 8 o'clock sharp, carrying Lady Althea's morning tea on a silver tray. Her screams brought half the hotel running, and when Gaspard and I broke down the door, for it was still bolted from within, we found a scene that will haunt my dreams for years to come. Lady Althea lay in the center of the room, her body twisted in an attitude of profound terror, her eyes wide and staring at something only she could see. Around her throat, livid against the pale skin, was the unmistakable mark of strangulation, a perfect circle of bruises that spoke of hands that had gripped with deadly purpose. But it was the impossibility of the situation that struck us most forcefully. The door had been bolted from the inside, just as we had left it. The windows remained locked, their heavy latches undisturbed. There was no way in or out of that room save through the door we had just broken down. "Mon Dieu," whispered Gaspard, crossing himself. "The weeping woman. She has claimed another victim." Poirot stood in the doorway, his face grave and thoughtful. His eyes moved systematically around the room, taking in every detail: the overturned chair, the extinguished lamp, the small table that had been pushed askew. "No, mon ami," he said quietly. "There are no ghosts here. Lady Althea has been murdered, and murdered by human hands. But how—" He paused, his gaze fixed on something near the fireplace. "How the killer entered and escaped from this sealed room, sir, that is a problem worthy of Hercule Poirot." He looked at me, his green eyes bright with the light of the chase. "The game, Hastings, has begun, and I suspect we shall find that the truth behind the weeping woman is far more terrible than any ghost story." The storm had begun to abate by the time Inspector Treadwell arrived from the nearby village, his substantial frame and weathered face speaking of a man more accustomed to dealing with poachers and petty theft than locked-room murders. He stood in the tower room, scratching his grizzled head with evident bewilderment, while Poirot moved about the space with the precision of a clockwork figure. "It's a rum business, Monsieur Poirot," Treadwell grunted, surveying the scene. "Door bolted from the inside, windows locked tight, and no other way in or out. Unless the lady strangled herself, which the doctor says is impossible given the angle of the bruises, we're chasing shadows." Poirot had been examining the heavy brass bolt that had secured the door, his magnifying glass catching the grey morning light. "Shadows do not leave fingerprints, Inspector, nor do they require leverage to crush a windpipe. This mechanism is genuine. It was thrown from the inside. The wood around the socket shows the splintering from our forced entry, but beneath that, the wear patterns are consistent with normal use. No tampering, no manipulation from without. He moved to the fireplace, peering up into the darkness of the flue with characteristic thoroughness. The chimney is far too narrow, and there is no disturbance in the soot. Our murderer did not descend like Father Christmas. His attention shifted to a small mahogany table beside the bed, where a bottle of sleeping draught stood empty alongside an untouched glass of water. "Observe, Inspector. The bottle is empty, yet the water remains full. And see here, on this velvet armchair, the pile is crushed on the left side, suggesting someone sat here, perhaps conversing with Lady Althea before the violence began. Someone she trusted enough to admit to her sanctuary." Treadwell frowned. "But if someone was in here with her, how did they get out? The boat—" "Forget the boat for a moment," Poirot interrupted gently. "Consider instead the psychology. Who did Lady Althea fear? Everyone, I suspect, but who did she trust? That, mon ami, is the crucial question." We descended to the main lounge to begin the formal interviews. The guests sat in uncomfortable silence, the weight of tragedy pressing down upon the elegant room like a physical presence. Monsieur Gaspard fluttered about with brandy, his hands shaking so violently the glasses chimed together like funeral bells. The storm still rattled the windows, but the drama within had far eclipsed the tempest without. Poirot positioned himself before the fireplace, his green eyes surveying each face in turn. "We begin," he announced, his voice cutting through the oppressive quiet, "with the person who discovered our tragedy. Miss Crane, if you would be so kind." Dorothy Crane looked up from her sodden handkerchief, her eyes red-rimmed with grief and something else. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. "I brought her ladyship her morning tea at 8 o'clock, as always. I knocked, but there was no answer. I called her name, and then—" She shuddered. "I heard a sound, a heavy thud, like something falling." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "A thud, mademoiselle? You are quite certain? The medical examiner estimates Lady Althea had been dead for at least 6 hours when you found her. Dead bodies do not typically move about and fall over in the morning." The silence that followed was absolute. Miss Crane flushed a deep, uncomfortable red. Perhaps I imagined it. The wind was so loud and I was frightened." "Fear makes us hear many things," Poirot allowed diplomatically. "Tell me, was your mistress a kind employer?" "She gave me a home when my father died penniless," Dorothy whispered. "She provided for me, educated me, made me her confidant." "That is not quite an answer to my question." Dorothy's voice hardened almost imperceptibly. "She was exacting. She demanded perfection in all things. Her tongue could be cruel, but I owed her everything." "Gratitude," Poirot mused softly. "Sometimes a heavier burden than debt itself." He turned his penetrating gaze to the man standing by the window. "Mr. Pembroke, you seem remarkably composed for one who has just lost his aunt." Silas Pembroke faced him with cool defiance. "I will not play the hypocrite, Monsieur Poirot. My aunt was a tyrant who controlled our family fortune with an iron fist. She delighted in dangling my inheritance before me like a carrot before a donkey. I am her sole heir, and I will not pretend devastation at inheriting what should have been mine years ago." "Refreshing honesty," Poirot observed. "And your whereabouts last evening?" "In my room, reading. The night porter can confirm he saw light under my door at 2 in the morning. Reading, a solitary activity. And your room is, I believe, a mere 20 paces from the tower." Silas's eyes narrowed. "Indeed it is. But the door was bolted, was it not? Unless you're suggesting I can walk through solid oak, my proximity is irrelevant." Poirot smiled, an expression as cold as winter frost. "In my experience, Mr. Pembroke, nothing is ever irrelevant, especially not in a house where walls have ears and doors keep secrets." The little Belgian detective's eyes glittered with the light of the hunt. The game, as he was fond of saying, had truly begun. Julian Ashford had been observing the proceedings with the detached fascination of a playwright watching an unexpectedly compelling rehearsal. When Poirot's penetrating gaze settled upon him, the young man straightened with theatrical flair, one hand adjusting the silk scarf at his throat. "Ah, the artist," Poirot murmured. "You came here seeking inspiration for your ghost story, did you not? Tell me, monsieur, did last night provide the material you sought?" Ashford's lips curved in a sardonic smile. "If by material you mean witnessing the impossible made manifest, then yes, Monsieur Poirot. Though I confess I'd hoped for atmospheric weeping, not actual murder. Reality has quite outdone my imagination." "Reality often does," Poirot observed dryly. "Your movements last evening, if you please." "I worked in the lounge until nearly midnight, making notes on the storm's effect on the building's acoustics. Fascinating how the wind creates voices in the walls. Then I retired to my room." Ashford paused, his expression growing more serious. "I must confess, professional curiosity got the better of me. Around midnight I slipped out to listen at the tower room door. The admission sent a ripple of tension through the assembled company." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "And what did you hear?" "Weeping," Ashford said quietly. Low, rhythmic sobbing that seemed to come from within the room itself. It continued for perhaps half an hour, then stopped abruptly. I heard a sound, a metallic scratching, very faint, and then silence. I waited another few minutes but heard nothing more, so I returned to my room." "You heard a woman in distress and did not attempt to offer assistance?" I asked, unable to keep the disapproval from my voice. Ashford shrugged. "The door was bolted, Captain Hastings. I'd heard the bolt slide home earlier in the evening. What could I have done? Besides, I assumed it was merely Lady Althea discovering that her skepticism was perhaps misplaced." Poirot studied the young man intently. "This metallic scratching, describe it more precisely." "Like a wire being drawn across metal, or perhaps a needle against glass. Very delicate, but distinct in the silence that followed the weeping." "Most interesting." Poirot turned his attention to Major Thornbury, who had been sitting rigidly throughout Ashford's testimony, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Major, you visited Lady Althea in her room last evening, did you not?" The old soldier's face flushed a deep red. That is to say," he cleared his throat with military precision. "Yes, I went to speak with her around 10 o'clock. "The nature of this conversation?" Major Thornbury's jaw worked silently for a moment before he spoke. "Lady Althea held certain financial obligations of mine, gaming debts from years past. She had threatened to expose them to my club, which would have meant social ruin. I went to plead with her one final time." "And her response?" "She laughed," Thornbury said bitterly. "Sat in that damned chair and laughed at me. Said she enjoyed watching me squirm, that it amused her to hold such power over a man who had once thought himself her superior." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She was a beautiful woman once, you know, before she became what she became." Poirot's expression remained carefully neutral. "You left her alive and well." "Alive, yes. Well," Thornbury shook his head. "I heard her throw the bolt as I walked away. She was very much alive and very much enjoying my humiliation." "So we have a timeline emerging," Poirot mused, beginning to pace the room with measured steps. "Major Thornbury leaves at 10 o'clock, and the door is bolted. Mr. Ashford hears weeping from midnight until approximately 12:30, followed by a metallic scratching. The medical evidence suggests death occurred between 1 and 3 in the morning." He paused, his green eyes thoughtful. "Yet we have a room that was sealed from within, with no possible means of entry or escape." It was then that his gaze fell upon Miss Crane, who had remained huddled in her corner throughout the interviews, twisting her handkerchief with increasingly agitated movements. Her face was pale, and there were dark circles beneath her red-rimmed eyes. "Miss Crane," Poirot said gently, You have been very quiet during these proceedings, yet you were the one who discovered the tragedy. Tell me, did you sleep well last night?" I barely slept at all," she stammered. "The storm, and I was worried about her ladyship. She could be so stubborn when she set her mind to something." "Worried enough, perhaps, to check on her welfare." Miss Crane's hands stilled on the handkerchief. "I don't understand what you mean." Poirot moved closer, his voice remaining kind, but his eyes sharp as steel. "You possess a duplicate key to the tower room, do you not? As Lady Althea's companion, you would naturally have access to her quarters." "Yes, but the door was bolted. The key would be useless with the bolt thrown from inside." "Indeed it would," Poirot agreed, "which makes it curious that when I examined your apron pocket earlier, I found traces of oil on your key ring. Fresh oil, mademoiselle, and a small speck of red sealing wax." The silence that followed was absolute. Miss Crane's face had gone chalk white, and her hands were trembling visibly. I did try to check on her," she whispered finally. "After the Major left, she was so agitated, so angry. I thought perhaps she might need her sleeping draught to calm her nerves, but the door was bolted just as you said. I couldn't enter." Poirot nodded slowly, yet the sleeping draught bottle beside Lady Althea's bed was found empty this morning, though the glass of water remained untouched. If you could not enter to administer it, and she did not take it herself, then who, mademoiselle, emptied that bottle?" He allowed the question to hang in the air like smoke, his gaze moving from face to face, reading the secrets written in their expressions. "Someone in this room," he continued quietly, "possesses knowledge they have not shared. Someone understands how a locked room may be entered, how a bolt may be manipulated, how a murder may be committed in a space that appears sealed to the world." His eyes glittered with the light of the hunt. "But patience, mes amis. Hercule Poirot will unravel this knot, thread by thread, until the truth stands naked before us all." The storm continued to rage outside, but within the elegant lounge, a different kind of tempest was brewing, one that would soon sweep away all pretense and reveal the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of respectability. The afternoon brought a sullen grey light that seemed to drain all warmth from the tower room as Poirot conducted his second, more thorough examination of the crime scene. Inspector Treadwell had departed to telegraph his superiors, leaving us alone with the oppressive silence that seemed to cling to the circular chamber like a shroud. "Now, Hastings," Poirot murmured, kneeling beside the fireplace with surprising agility. "The room can speak to us without the distraction of officialdom." He produced a small torch and directed its beam up into the chimney flue. "The soot is undisturbed, the brickwork solid. Our murderer did not arrive by way of Father Christmas, that is certain." He moved to the heavy oak door, examining the brass bolt mechanism with his magnifying glass. "Observe this scratch on the underside of the handle, and here, a minute indentation in the door frame, as if something thin and strong had been inserted between door and frame." "But the bolt was secured from the inside," I protested. "Even if you could slip something through the crack, precisely the problem, mon ami. Unless—" He paused, his green eyes thoughtful. "Unless the bolt was manipulated before the door was closed. But that would require an accomplice, or—" His voice trailed off as he began a methodical search of the room. It was beneath the four-poster bed that he found the first significant clue, a small handkerchief monogrammed with the initials D.C., stained with a dark, sticky residue that carried the distinctive bittersweet odor of laudanum. "Miss Crane," I breathed, "but why dispose of the sleeping draught here?" "To ensure Lady Althea remained awake and alert," Poirot replied grimly. "A sleeping victim would not produce the sounds Mr. Ashford heard, the weeping that continued for half an hour." He pocketed the handkerchief carefully, then moved to the velvet armchair that had shown signs of occupancy. From between the cushions, he extracted a single long hair, dark brown, shot through with grey, distinctly coarser than Lady Althea's silver tresses. "Most interesting. Someone sat here, conversing with our victim before the violence began. A soft knock interrupted our investigation. Mrs. Vines, the gaunt housekeeper, stood in the doorway with obvious reluctance. "Begging your pardon, sir, but Monsieur Gaspard said you might have questions for the staff." "Indeed, madame. You have worked in this hotel many years?" "Near 30, sir. I knew this place when it was just a boarding house. Lady Althea, she wanted to replace half of us with cheaper girls from London, but wanting someone gone and murdering them, that's different business entirely." "You heard footsteps last night?" "Around 12:30, maybe nearer 1. Couldn't say who. I sleep light, but I didn't open my door." After she departed, Poirot turned his attention to the small writing desk in the corner. He lifted a sheet of blotting paper and held it to the mirror above the mantelpiece. "Voilà," he breathed. Lady Althea was writing a letter. See the reverse impression of her script. He traced the ghostly letters reflected in the glass. "My dear Silas, the truth can no longer be hidden. The child," and then it cuts off. "The child," I repeated, mystified. "A secret, Hastings. Something that has festered in this family like an infected wound." He carefully placed the blotting paper in his pocket, then stooped to examine something glittering in the carpet pile. A tiny sequin of iridescent blue plastic. "Lady Althea wore diamonds and black velvet," I observed. "No sequins." "Precisely. Someone else was in this room. Someone whose clothing would shed such a frivolous ornament." As we descended to the lobby, a commotion at the front desk drew our attention. Julian Ashford was arguing with the concierge, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged space. "I must send a telegram immediately. It's a matter of life and death." Poirot approached with the silent grace of a hunting cat. "Life and death, Monsieur Ashford, or perhaps the preservation of one's own skin." Ashford spun around, his face pale. "Poirot, This murder changes everything for my play. The ending, I have to change the ending." "Because reality has become inconvenient?" Poirot asked softly. "Or because the ending you wrote is dangerously close to the truth?" For the first time, the playwright's arrogant facade cracked, revealing raw fear beneath. "You don't understand," he whispered. "The ghost story wasn't just a story. Lady Althea believed it. She wasn't trying to disprove the ghost. She was trying to meet it." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "Meet it? Why?" "Because," Ashford said, his voice trembling, "she thought the weeping woman was her sister." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Suddenly, the pieces of our puzzle began to shift and realign, forming a pattern far more complex and terrible than we had imagined. The revelation hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, heavy with implications that reached far beyond the storm-lashed walls of the Blackwood Hotel. Poirot regarded Ashford with the intense focus of a jeweler examining a particularly complex stone, his green eyes reflecting both satisfaction and growing concern. "Her sister," he repeated softly, his accent lending gravity to each syllable. "But this is most illuminating, Monsieur Ashford. You will tell me everything, s'il vous plaît, and you will omit nothing, however trivial it may seem." We retired to the small study that Gaspard had placed at our disposal, its leather-bound volumes and mahogany desk providing a sanctuary from the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of the main hotel. Ashford settled into a wingback chair, his theatrical composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of genuine fear. "I came here to research a ghost story," he began, his voice losing its customary sardonic edge. "But what I discovered was far more substantial than mere legend. The parish records in the village speak of Lady Althea's younger sister, Constance, beautiful, fragile, and prone to what the Victorians delicately termed nervous disorders." Poirot's fingers formed their characteristic steeple beneath his chin. "Continue." 23 years ago, Constance arrived at this hotel during a terrible winter storm, carrying an infant daughter. The child was sickly, born too early, and within a week had succumbed to fever. Constance, in her grief and what the local doctor described as temporary insanity, threw herself from the tower room window 3 days after the burial. And Lady Althea's connection to this tragedy? Ashford's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his cigarette case. That's where the story becomes complicated. Local gossip, the kind that servants whisper and villagers remember, suggested that the child was not Constance's at all, but Lady Althea's own illegitimate daughter. Constance, already considered mentally unstable, was the perfect guardian for a scandal that would have destroyed the Pembroke family's reputation. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. You mean Lady Althea condemned her own child to death by sending her away? And condemned her sister to madness and suicide when the truth became unbearable, Ashford confirmed grimly. Lady Althea told me herself 2 nights ago when the brandy had loosened her tongue. She said she had lived with the guilt for over 2 decades and that she sometimes heard Constance weeping in the wind. Poirot rose abruptly, his movements sharp with purpose. We must speak with Monsieur Silas immediately. If what you suggest is true, then Lady Althea's decision to reveal this secret would have profound implications for the family inheritance. We found Silas Pembroke in the conservatory, surrounded by the hotel's collection of exotic plants that seemed to thrive despite the Gothic atmosphere pervading the rest of the building. He stood with his back to us, staring out at the storm-lashed grounds, a half-finished whiskey in his hand. Mr. Pembroke, Poirot began without preamble, we must discuss the letter your aunt was writing to you last night, the one that mentions the truth and the child. Silas turned slowly, and I was struck by how much he had aged since morning. The arrogant confidence had drained from his features, leaving behind a man who looked haunted by possibilities he could no longer ignore. She was going to destroy everything, he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind. After 23 years of silence, she suddenly developed what she called a dying woman's conscience. She wanted to find Constance's child, or rather her own child, and make restitution. The child survived, Poirot asked sharply. That's what she believed. She had received information suggesting that the infant who died was not her daughter at all, but another child who had been substituted. She thought her real daughter might still be alive, hidden away in some provincial orphanage or foster home. Silas drained his whiskey in one gulp. She was prepared to acknowledge her publicly, to legitimize her, to make her an heir to the Pembroke fortune. The implication struck me like a physical blow, which would have destroyed your inheritance. Completely, Silas confirmed bitterly. But I didn't kill her. Yes, I argued with her. Yes, I told her she was mad to destroy our lives for a 20-year-old mistake, but I left her alive and well, barricaded in that damned room with her guilt and her ghosts. Poirot studied him with a penetrating gaze that had unraveled so many deceptions. At what time did you leave her? Just before midnight. She was crying, actually crying. I had never seen Lady Althea shed a tear in my entire life. She said she could hear Constance calling to her, asking for forgiveness. He shuddered. I told her she was becoming as mad as her sister, and she laughed. A terrible sound, like breaking glass. The last thing I heard was the bolt sliding home as she locked herself in. And you saw no one else in the corridor? No one. Though, he hesitated, his brow furrowing. I did hear something odd as I walked away, a sound like fabric rustling and what might have been sobbing, but the wind was so loud I couldn't be certain. We left Silas to his whiskey and his fears and made our way to the servants' quarters. Poirot's expression had grown increasingly grave, and I could see the wheels of deduction turning behind his sharp green eyes. We found Dorothy Crane in the laundry room, her hands moving mechanically over a basket of linens while tears streamed down her pale cheeks. Mademoiselle, Poirot said gently, I believe you have something to tell us. She looked up with the expression of a trapped animal, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "I didn't kill her," she whispered. "I swear on my father's grave I didn't kill her. But I—" She dissolved into sobs, her entire body shaking with the force of her confession. "You knew about Constance," Poirot said, not unkindly, "and about the child." "Lady Althea told me everything years ago, when she was in her cups and feeling maudlin. She made me promise never to speak of it, but she couldn't stop herself from talking about it when the anniversary came around. Every year, she would drink too much and tell me about the daughter she had sacrificed and the sister she had destroyed. And last night," Dorothy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She was different, excited, almost fevered. She said she had received proof that her daughter was alive, and that she was going to make everything right. She was going to acknowledge her publicly, legitimize her, bring her into the family." Her hands twisted the damp linen until her knuckles were white. I tried to talk her out of it. I told her it would destroy us all, that some secrets were better left buried, but she wouldn't listen. "So you decided to frighten her," Poirot observed, "to make her believe that Constance's ghost had returned to prevent the revelation." Dorothy nodded miserably. "I found an old blue dress in the hotel's costume trunk, something theatrical and flowing. I stood in the corridor outside the tower room and wept, hoping she would think it was Constance's spirit. I thought if she was frightened enough, she would abandon her plan and return to London." "And the metallic scratching that Mr. Ashford heard?" "I tried to pick the lock," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I wanted to get inside and leave some sort of spirit message on her mirror, something that would convince her that Constance was warning her away, but the bolt was thrown from the inside. I couldn't get in no matter how I tried." Poirot's eyes had grown very still, and I recognized the expression that preceded his most brilliant deductions. "So you provided the perfect cover, mademoiselle. While you wept and scratched at the door like a genuine ghost, someone else, someone who knew the real secret of the tower room, was already inside, waiting for Lady Althea to meet her fate." He turned to me, his face grave with understanding. "The weeping woman was indeed a fraud, Hastings, but the murder was all too real, and now I believe I understand not only who committed this crime, but how they managed to escape from a room that was sealed from within." The pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was more terrible than any ghost story. As we prepared to confront the truth, I could not shake the feeling that the real horror was only just beginning to unfold. The evening had settled over the Blackwood Hotel with the weight of accumulated secrets, and Poirot insisted we return once more to the tower room. Dorothy Crane's confession had provided one piece of the puzzle. The weeping woman was indeed a fraud, but it had also revealed something far more sinister. Her theatrical ghost had provided the perfect cover for a very real murder. "You see, Hastings," Poirot murmured as we climbed the narrow stairs to the east corridor, "Miss Crane has unwittingly become our most valuable witness. While she wept and scratched at the door like a creature from beyond, she was also the perfect alibi for our true killer. Who would suspect murder when everyone's attention was fixed on supernatural manifestations?" The tower room felt different now in the lamplight, less oppressive, more clinical. Poirot moved with renewed purpose, his sharp eyes cataloguing details that had escaped our earlier examinations. He paused before the heavy velvet curtains, pulling them aside with a sudden motion that made me start. "Observe, mon ami," he said, pointing to the window latch. "A single black thread, caught in the mechanism. But more interesting still, see how the metal shows recent scratches, as if it has been worked from the outside." I peered closer, noting the tiny marks he indicated. "But surely no one could climb this tower in a storm." "No, not climb up," Poirot agreed, moving to examine the window frame more carefully. "But consider what lies above this room." Without waiting for my answer, he produced a thin wire from his pocket and, with delicate precision, manipulated the latch from the inside. It moved with suspicious ease. "The mechanism has been tampered with," he observed with satisfaction, "modified so that it could be opened from without by someone with the proper tools and knowledge. But the question remains, How did our killer reach this window? We made our way to the roof access, finding the heavy door unlocked and the dusty floorboards marked with the circular impression of a coiled rope. Poirot's torch beam revealed traces of the same lubricating oil we had found on Dorothy's key ring. So our killer descended from above, I said, beginning to understand. But in that storm, the storm was their ally, not their enemy, Poirot interrupted. It masked the sound of their approach, provided cover for their movements, and ensured that any witness would dismiss unusual sounds as merely the wind. He straightened, his expression growing grave. But this was not a crime of opportunity, Hastings. This was planned with meticulous care by someone who knew the hotel's architecture intimately. We returned to the conservatory, where the remaining guests sat in uncomfortable silence. The storm continued to rage outside, but there was a different quality to the atmosphere within, a sense of approaching revelation that made everyone shift nervously in their chairs. "Mes amis," Poirot began, positioning himself where the lamplight would illuminate every face. "We have learned much today about ghosts and guilt, about secrets that span decades and crimes that seem impossible. But Hercule Poirot does not believe in impossibilities. When we strip away the supernatural theatrics, we find a murder that was both ingenious and deeply personal." He began his characteristic pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. Lady Althea entered this room expecting to confront her past, perhaps even hoping to find redemption for the sins that had haunted her for 23 years. She bolted the door not to keep others out, but to ensure privacy for what she believed would be a reunion with the daughter she had abandoned. Silas Pembroke leaned forward sharply. "You mean she expected someone to come to her?" "Precisely. Someone she had been corresponding with, someone who had convinced her they were the child she had given away." Poirot's eyes glittered with understanding. But instead of forgiveness, she found death. Death at the hands of someone who had nursed their hatred for decades, someone who had waited patiently for the perfect moment to strike. Major Thornbury cleared his throat roughly. "You're speaking in riddles, Poirot. If you know who killed her, say so plainly." "Patience, Major. The truth, she requires careful handling." Poirot moved to stand before the ornate fountain. "Consider the nature of the crime itself. Lady Althea was strangled, a deeply personal method of killing that requires the murderer to look into their victim's eyes as life fades. This was not robbery, not a crime of passion in the heat of the moment. This was execution." Julian Ashford shifted uncomfortably in his chair. But who could have hated her enough for such brutality? Yes, she was difficult, controlling, but murder. But you think like someone who knew Lady Althea only in her later years, Poirot interrupted. You did not know the young woman who condemned her own child to death rather than face scandal. You did not know the sister who drove her sibling to madness and suicide rather than share her burden of guilt. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the storm seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath. "The child," I breathed, understanding flooding through me. "The daughter she abandoned, she's still alive." "Very much alive," Poirot confirmed, "and very much present in this hotel. Someone who has watched and waited, who learned of Lady Althea's guilt and planned the perfect revenge. Someone who convinced her that redemption was possible, that forgiveness could be found in the very room where her sister had met her tragic end." He turned to face the assembled company, his green eyes bright with the light of revelation. The killer descended from the roof on a rope, entered through the modified window, and strangled Lady Althea, while Dorothy Crane provided the perfect supernatural distraction in the corridor below. Then they escaped the same way, leaving behind a locked room mystery that seemed impossible to solve. "But who?" Silas demanded, his voice cracking with strain. "Who among us could have done such a thing?" Poirot's smile was cold as winter frost. "Someone who had access to the hotel's architectural plans, who understood the building's history intimately, who could move through its corridors unseen and unremarked." He paused, his gaze moving deliberately to the doorway, where a figure stood silhouetted against the lamplight. Someone, he continued quietly, who has been serving this family faithfully for 30 years, earning their trust while nursing an unquenchable thirst for revenge. Someone whose own daughter died because of Lady Althea's selfishness and cruelty. Mrs. Vines stepped into the light, her gaunt face expressionless, her hands steady as she set down her tea tray. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of suppressed fury. "She killed my child," the housekeeper said simply, "and she deserved everything she got." The revelation hung in the air like incense, heavy with the weight of long-delayed justice. But even as Inspector Treadwell moved to arrest her, I could see in Poirot's eyes that the story was far from over. There were still secrets to be revealed, still pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. The weeping woman of Blackwood Hotel had finally been silenced, but her legacy of pain and retribution was only just beginning to unfold. Mrs. Vines made no attempt to flee as Inspector Treadwell approached with his handcuffs. She stood with the rigid dignity of a woman who had finally spoken a truth too long buried, her weathered hands steady as she set down her tea service with practiced precision. "You'll want the full story, I expect," she said, her voice carrying the flat exhaustion of someone who had carried a burden for 3 decades. After 30 years of silence, it seems almost a relief to speak it aloud. Poirot gestured for Treadwell to wait, his sharp green eyes never leaving the housekeeper's face. "We have time, madame, but I confess, there are certain details that still require clarification." Mrs. Vines settled into a straight-backed chair, her movements careful and deliberate. "I was lady's maid to Miss Constance before I became housekeeper here. A gentle soul she was, but fragile as spun glass. When she arrived at this hotel 23 years ago with that poor, sickly child, I could see the madness already creeping into her eyes. Her voice hardened, edged with decades of suppressed fury. Lady Althea had told everyone the child was Constance's illegitimate daughter, born of some scandalous affair, but I knew better. I had seen Lady Althea through her own confinement, helped deliver that baby in secret. She made me swear on my own daughter's grave that I would never speak of it." The weight of truth. "The child that died here wasn't Lady Althea's daughter at all," Mrs. Vines continued, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the storm-lashed windows. "It was my own granddaughter, Sarah, a sickly babe I had been caring for while her mother worked in service. When Lady Althea's healthy daughter fell ill with fever, she panicked. She couldn't let her own child die. Too many questions, too much risk of exposure. So she switched them." The horror of the revelation settled over the room like a shroud. Dorothy Crane, who had been standing silently near the doorway, swayed visibly and gripped the doorframe for support. "She took my dying Sarah and put her in place of her own child," Mrs. Vines said, her voice cracking for the first time. "Told me it was God's will, that Sarah would have died anyway, but her own daughter, her own flesh and blood, she gave away to strangers rather than face the scandal." "And Miss Constance?" Poirot asked gently. "Poor Miss Constance knew something was wrong, but not what. The guilt of it, the weight of Lady Althea's lies, it destroyed what was left of her mind. 3 days after my Sarah died, she went out through that tower window." Mrs. Vines's eyes were dry, but they burned with an inner fire that spoke of grief transformed into something harder and more dangerous. Poirot's doubts. As Inspector Treadwell prepared to lead her away, Poirot remained motionless, his expression deeply troubled. The little Belgian detective's head was tilted at that characteristic angle that indicated his mind was working furiously through some complex problem. "A moment, Inspector," he said quietly. "Mrs. Vines, your confession is most moving, and your motive is certainly compelling, but I am troubled by certain inconsistencies." He moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "You described descending from the roof on a rope in the midst of a terrible storm. Yet when I examined the attic this morning, the rope marks on the floor were circular, the pattern of a coil stored, not used. A rope employed for such a purpose would leave linear abrasions, drag marks where it scraped against stone. Mrs. Vine's composure faltered slightly. Perhaps I misremembered the details. The night was chaotic, the storm, and there is the matter of the sequin, Poirot continued relentlessly. A tiny ornament of iridescent blue, found on the carpet beside Lady Althea's body. You wear only black wool and starched cotton, madame. A sequin has no place in the wardrobe of a grieving woman bent on revenge. He turned to face her directly, his expression kind but implacable. You did not kill Lady Althea Pembroke, Mrs. Vines. You are confessing to shield someone else, someone you care for deeply enough to sacrifice your own freedom. The true connection. The silence that followed was broken by a soft sob from the doorway. Dorothy Crane stepped forward, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she twisted her handkerchief. She's protecting me, Dorothy whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. She's always protected me, ever since I was a child in that terrible orphanage. She would visit, bring me books, tell me stories about better places. I never knew why until Lady Althea began speaking of acknowledging her lost daughter. Poirot finished gently. Until you realized that the woman you had served faithfully for 15 years was the mother who had abandoned you. Dorothy nodded miserably. When she started receiving those letters I helped her write, pretending they came from someone who had discovered her daughter's whereabouts. I thought perhaps she truly meant to make amends. But then she began speaking of bringing this daughter into the family, of legitimizing her, of changing her will, and you realized that your years of faithful service meant nothing, I said, understanding flooding through me. That you would be cast aside once again in favor of this mysterious daughter who was, in fact, yourself. I couldn't bear it, Dorothy sobbed, to be thrown away again, to watch her lavish attention on someone who didn't exist while I remained invisible. So I told her the truth. I revealed who I really was. The final piece. Poirot's expression grew very grave, and her reaction was not what you had hoped. She laughed, Dorothy said bitterly. She stood there in that cursed room and laughed at me. Said she had suspected for years that she had kept me close precisely because it amused her to have her discarded daughter serving her tea and reading her correspondence. She said I was pathetic, that she would rather die than acknowledge such a weak, servile creature as her heir. The cruelty of it struck everyone in the room like a physical blow. Even Inspector Treadwell, hardened by years of dealing with humanity's darker impulses, looked shaken. So you strangled her, Poirot said quietly. Dorothy's hands flew to her throat, as if she could still feel the phantom pressure of that terrible moment. I don't remember crossing the room. I just remember her laughter and then silence. When I realized what I had done, I was terrified. Mrs. Vines found me there, helped me think of a way to make it look impossible. She said if the room was locked from the inside, no one would suspect murder. But how did you escape the locked room? I asked, still puzzled by the mechanics of the crime. Poirot smiled grimly. That, Hastings, was the simplest part of all. Miss Crane never left the room. She remained hidden, perhaps behind the heavy curtains or in the wardrobe, while we broke down the door. In the confusion of discovering the body, who would notice? One more person in the room, especially someone who belonged there, someone whose presence was expected and unremarkable. He turned to Dorothy, his expression mixing pity with stern judgment. You screamed when we entered, did you not? Not from shock at discovering the body, but to mask your emergence from hiding. A most audacious deception, mademoiselle. As the truth settled over the assembled company like dust after an explosion, Mrs. Vines reached out and took Dorothy's trembling hand in her own weathered grasp. She's not a killer by nature, the older woman said firmly to Inspector Treadwell. She's a broken child who finally struck back at the woman who broke her. If anyone deserves punishment, it's Lady Althea herself for the cruelties she inflicted on everyone she touched. But Hercule Poirot, master of the human heart's darker corners, knew that justice was rarely so simple, and that the ghosts of the past had claimed one final victim in the storm-lashed tower of the Blackwood Hotel. The weeping woman had indeed returned, not as a supernatural spectre, but as the living embodiment of a mother's sins, finally demanding payment for decades of abandonment and cruelty. The confession hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle, but Poirot remained perfectly still, his green eyes fixed not on Dorothy's tear-streaked face, but on some invisible calculation that seemed to trouble him deeply. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, broken only by the diminishing fury of the storm outside. "None," he said finally, his voice cutting through the emotional atmosphere with surgical precision. "I cannot accept this confession, touching though it may be." Dorothy looked up sharply, confusion replacing the exhausted relief in her eyes. "But I've told you everything, how she laughed at me, how I lost control." "You have told me a story," Poirot interrupted gently but firmly. "A story designed to protect someone else, just as Mrs. Vines told her story to protect you. But neither story fits the evidence, mes amis." He began his characteristic pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. "Consider the physical facts. The bruising on Lady Althea's throat shows deep, even pressure applied from behind by someone of considerable strength. You, mademoiselle, forgive me, are of slight build, weakened by years of subservience. Could you truly have overpowered a robust woman like Lady Althea?" Inspector Treadwell frowned. "But if she caught her by surprise?" "The medical evidence suggests otherwise," Poirot continued. "There are additional bruises on Lady Althea's wrists and forearms, defensive wounds indicating a struggle. This was not a crime of sudden passion, but a calculated execution." He turned to face the assembled company, his expression grave. "Furthermore, there is the matter of timing. Miss Crane claims to have confronted Lady Althea and killed her in a fit of rage. Yet, Mr. Ashford heard rhythmic weeping from midnight until 12:30. If Lady Althea was already dead, who produced those sounds?" Julian Ashford shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I heard what I heard, Poirot. A woman sobbing, continuous and heartbreaking." "Indeed you did, but not the sounds of a dying woman or her killer's remorse." Poirot's eyes glittered with understanding. "You heard the sounds of someone who had discovered a body and was paralyzed with grief and terror." His penetrating gaze settled on Dorothy. "You did enter that room, mademoiselle, but not as a killer. You went to check on Lady Althea after her disturbing conversation with her nephew. You found her already dead, strangled in her chair. The weeping Mr. Ashford heard was your own, the sound of a woman confronting the corpse of the mother who had abandoned her." Dorothy's face crumpled. I couldn't move. I just sat there, holding her hand, crying for everything we had lost. When I heard footsteps in the corridor, I hid behind the curtains, terrified of being discovered. And there you remained until we broke down the door," Poirot concluded. "Hidden in plain sight, emerging in the confusion of discovery. A desperate deception born of panic, not guilt. The web of deception unravels." Poirot moved to stand before the fireplace, his expression growing darker. "But if Miss Crane did not kill Lady Althea, who did? Someone with the strength to overpower her, the cunning to create an impossible crime, and the motive to silence her forever." His gaze swept the room before settling on Silas Pembroke, who had been watching the proceedings with unnatural calm. "Mr. Pembroke, you have been remarkably composed for a man who has just learned that his inheritance was in jeopardy. Tell me, when exactly did you discover that Miss Crane was not Lady Althea's daughter, but her niece, the rightful heir to the Pembroke fortune?" The effect was electric. Silas's face went chalk white, and several guests gasped in astonishment. "That's absurd," Silas stammered. "Constance's child died 23 years ago." "So everyone believed," Poirot agreed. "But you discovered the truth, didn't you? The child who died was Lady Althea's own daughter. Sickly, premature, doomed from birth. The healthy child who survived the fever was Constance's daughter, sent away to protect the family from scandal. Miss Crane is not the abandoned daughter of a cruel woman. She is the rightful heir, hidden in plain sight as a servant in her own ancestral home. Dorothy stared at him in shock. But that would mean that you are the legitimate heir to everything Lady Althea possessed, Poirot confirmed gently, and that Mr. Pembroke has known this for some time. How long have you been searching for the proof, monsieur? How long have you been cultivating Miss Crane's affections while planning her destruction? The locked room revealed. Silas's composure finally cracked. You have no proof. The door was bolted from inside. Even if I had killed her, how could I have escaped? An excellent question, Poirot replied, moving to the window. The answer lies not in ropes or supernatural intervention, but in the simple fact that you never entered through the door at all. You used the window, but not by climbing down from above. He gestured toward the storm-lashed grounds. Your room has a balcony that faces the tower at an angle. The distance is perhaps 12 feet, easily bridged by a man with mountaineering experience. You used a grappling hook and line, crossed to the tower window, and entered while Lady Althea was writing her letter of acknowledgement. The window was locked. From the inside, yes. But you had prepared for that days earlier, filing the mechanism so it could be manipulated from without. The oil traces on the latch, the fresh scratches on the metal, all evidence of your preparation. Poirot's voice grew cold with certainty. You strangled Lady Althea while she sat writing the letter that would have legitimized Miss Crane. Then you returned to your room via the same route, pulling the line after you. The perfect locked room murder, or so you believed. The final evidence. But you made one crucial error, Poirot continued, producing a small object from his waistcoat pocket. This metal filing, caught in the window mechanism. The metal matches the tools in your traveling kit exactly. And there is something else. He held up a fragment of paper, a portion of the letter Lady Althea was writing when you killed her. My dear Silas, I can no longer live with the deception. Dorothy must take her rightful place as Constance's daughter and the true heir to our family fortune. You tried to burn it, but one piece survived in the fireplace. Silas looked around the room desperately, seeing condemnation in every face. She was going to destroy everything, our family's reputation, my future, everything we had worked to build. So you destroyed her instead, Poirot said quietly, and would have destroyed Miss Crane as well, once you had secured her affections enough to marry her and claim her inheritance through legal manipulation. The confession hung in the air for a moment before Silas suddenly lunged, not toward the door, but toward Dorothy herself, his hands reaching for her throat with desperate fury. If I can't have it, no one will. But Major Thornberry was faster than his years suggested. The old soldier intercepted Silas with a tackle that sent both men crashing into a side table. Inspector Treadwell and I rushed forward, hauling a struggling, cursing Silas into handcuffs as he continued to rage about family honor and rightful inheritance. Justice and resolution. As they led him away, Poirot approached Dorothy, who stood trembling in Mrs. Vine's protective embrace. "It is finished, mademoiselle," he said gently. "You are free of the burden of false guilt, free of the chains of servitude. You are not the unwanted child of a selfish woman, but the beloved daughter of gentle Constance, protected even in death by those who truly cared for you." Mrs. Vine stroked Dorothy's hair with maternal tenderness. "I always knew," she whispered. "You had your mother's eyes, her gentle spirit. I've been waiting 23 years to tell you the truth." The storm outside had finally broken, leaving behind a crystalline silence that seemed to cleanse the very air. Through the tall windows, the first pale rays of dawn painted the sea in shades of pearl and gold. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said, straightening his tie with characteristic precision. "Our work here is complete. The weeping woman of Blackwood Hotel has been silenced at last, not by supernatural intervention, but by the inexorable power of truth and justice. As we prepared to depart, I looked back one final time at the tower room's dark windows. They reflected nothing now but empty sky, their secrets finally exposed to the light. The ghost of Constance Pembroke could rest at last, knowing that her daughter had found not only justice, but the family that had always been waiting to claim her. The affair at the Blackwood Hotel was closed, but its resolution had brought not just the punishment of the guilty, but the restoration of the innocent to their rightful place in the world. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The morning light streaming through the hotel's tall windows seemed to wash away the Gothic shadows that had clung to every corner during the storm. Yet as I observed my friend Hercule Poirot standing at the lobby window, his hands clasped behind his back, and his green eyes fixed on the now tranquil sea, I sensed a familiar restlessness that suggested our case was not quite as settled as it appeared. "Something still troubles you, Poirot," I ventured, joining him at the window where the pale sunlight painted the waves in shades of silver and gold. "Précisément, Hastings," he murmured, his accent lending weight to each syllable. "While justice has been served and Silas Pembroke awaits trial for his aunt's murder, there remain certain inconsistencies that offend my sense of order." Before I could press him further, Inspector Treadwell approached with his characteristic heavy tread, his weathered face creased with the satisfaction of a case well concluded. "Monsieur Poirot, the prisoner is secure, and I've telegraphed the Crown Prosecutor. A clear case of murder for gain, though I must say your reconstruction of how he crossed from his balcony was masterful." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Ah, Inspector, but that is precisely what troubles me. Upon reflection, I believe my initial theory about the method may have been, shall we say, overly dramatic. The truth, she is often more prosaic than our imaginations would have her be. The refined truth we gathered once more in the small study, where Dorothy Crane sat with Mrs. Vines, both women bearing the exhausted but peaceful expressions of those who had finally shed their burdens of secrecy. Silas Pembroke, brought back under guard at Poirot's request, wore a mixture of defiance and resignation that spoke of a man who knew his fate was sealed. "Mr. Pembroke," Poirot began, settling into his chair with characteristic precision, "I've been reconsidering the mechanics of your crime, the grappling hook, the rope crossing, such theatrical methods. None, but you are not, I think, a man given to unnecessary risks or romantic gestures." Silas regarded him warily. "I've confessed to nothing beyond what you've already deduced." "Indeed. But consider this. The tower room's door, while bolted from within, has a substantial gap beneath it. Sufficient, perhaps, for someone to slide a thin wire through and manipulate the bolt mechanism from the corridor side. The scratches I observed on the bolt could have been made from below, not from tampering with the window mechanism." Inspector Treadwell frowned. "But the room was still sealed when we arrived." "Because Mr. Pembroke resecured the bolt after the murder using the same wire technique. He then retreated to his room, secure in the knowledge that the locked room mystery would baffle investigators." Poirot's gaze never left Silas's face. "A much simpler method than mountaineering in a storm, and one that required only patience and a steady hand." Silas's composure finally cracked. "You're guessing. You have no proof of any wire." "No, but I have something better, the testimony of your own character. You are methodical, cautious, a man who plans for contingencies. The rope crossing was always too reckless, too dependent on factors beyond your control, but a wire, a few minutes of careful manipulation, that is more your style, is it not? Resolution and redemption." With the method clarified and Silas returned to custody, we turned our attention to the living victims of Lady Althea's long-ago cruelties. Dorothy Crane had undergone a remarkable transformation in the span of mere days. No longer the invisible companion, but a woman discovering her own worth and rightful place in the world. "I still cannot quite believe it," she confided to us as we sat in the conservatory, surrounded by the hotel's exotic plants that seemed to thrive despite the Gothic atmosphere pervading the rest of the building. All these years, I thought myself a burden, accepted on sufferance, to learn that I am the rightful heir to everything Lady Althea possessed. More than that, Mrs. Vines added gently, her stern mask softened by decades of suppressed maternal affection finally allowed to show. You are Constance's daughter, child of a gentle soul who loved you, enough to ensure your survival, even at the cost of her own sanity. Poirot leaned forward, his expression kind but serious. The question now, mademoiselle, is what you will do with this knowledge. Inheritance brings not only wealth, but responsibility. You have the power to break the cycle of cruelty that has defined the Pembroke family for generations. Explaining the legend. As our departure approached, Julian Ashford voiced the question that had been troubling several of us. The weeping woman legend that started all this. If Dorothy was crying over the body that night, and Silas was in his room, who was the original ghost that Lady Althea feared? Mrs. Vines looked up from her needlework, her expression distant with memory. That would be me, I'm afraid. In the years after Constance died and my Sarah was buried in her place, the grief sometimes became too much to bear in silence. During the hotel's quiet seasons, I would slip up to the tower room and weep for all that had been lost. The acoustics of the tower, the way the wind carried sound. I suppose it created quite an effect. So Lady Althea's guilt transformed your private mourning into a supernatural legend, I observed. She heard her own crimes echoed in your sorrow. Precisely, Poirot agreed. The human mind, it has a remarkable capacity for transforming guilt into fear, and fear into superstition. Lady Althea created her own ghost from the consequences of her actions. Poirot's final deduction. As we prepared to leave the Blackwood Hotel, Poirot paused in the lobby, his sharp eyes taking in every detail one final time. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, but the scars of human cruelty would take longer to heal. "You know, Hastings," he said as our taxi wound its way down the cliff road, "this case has reminded me of an important truth. We speak often of ghosts and hauntings, but the most persistent specters are those we create ourselves. Guilt, shame, the consequences of our choices. Lady Althea was haunted not by Constance's spirit, but by her own conscience. And yet, I reflected, in the end, it was human agency that brought justice, not supernatural intervention. Exactement. The living must answer for their crimes in this world, not wait for judgment in the next." He paused, reaching into his waistcoat pocket to produce a small glittering object. Though I must confess, even Hercule Poirot occasionally employs a touch of theatrical misdirection. I recognized the tiny blue sequin he had found in the tower room. Don't tell me that was another red herring. Poirot's eyes twinkled with mischief. A souvenir from a case involving a cabaret dancer last month. I dropped it quite by accident during my examination, but it served admirably to make our suspects nervous. Sometimes, mon ami, one must shake the tree to see what fruit falls, even if one uses the wrong stick. Epilogue. As the Blackwood Hotel disappeared behind the coastal hills, I reflected on the complex web of love, betrayal, and revenge we had untangled. Dorothy Crane would inherit not just wealth, but the opportunity to heal generations of family wounds. Mrs. Vines would finally be free to express the maternal love she had hidden for so long. And somewhere in a prison cell, Silas Pembroke would have years to contemplate how greed had transformed him from nephew to murderer. The weeping woman of Blackwood Hotel has been silenced at last, I said to Poirot as our train pulled away from the station. "No, Hastings," he replied thoughtfully, adjusting his tie with characteristic precision. "She has not been silenced, she has been answered. There is a difference. Constance Pembroke's daughter lives, thrives, and will ensure that the family's future is built on compassion rather than cruelty. That, mon ami, is the only victory that truly matters. The countryside rolled past our window, green and peaceful under the clearing sky, while behind us the Gothic towers of the Blackwood Hotel stood sentinel over secrets finally brought to light. The mystery was solved, justice served, and the living free to choose their own paths forward, which, as Hercule Poirot would say, explained everything. The grey November afternoon had settled over London like a familiar shroud when the telegram arrived at Poirot's flat, bearing news that would provide the final chapter to our Cornwall adventure. My friend sat in his precisely arranged sitting room, his green eyes scanning the official correspondence with characteristic attention to detail. "Voilà, Hastings," he announced, setting aside the telegram with satisfaction. "Justice has run its course. Silas Pembroke has been sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of his aunt. The courts have also formally recognized Dorothy Crane as the legitimate daughter of Constance Pembroke and sole heir to the family estate." "And Dorothy herself?" I inquired, settling into the chair opposite him. "How does she bear such a transformation of fortune?" Poirot produced a letter from his waistcoat pocket, its fine paper and confident script a marked contrast to the trembling woman we had left behind on that storm-swept morning. She writes with remarkable composure. "The Blackwood Hotel has been transformed into a refuge for women and children escaping difficult circumstances. Mrs. Vines serves as administrator, and together they have created something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy." He paused, his expression growing thoughtful. "She mentions that she has completely redecorated the tower room, new furnishings, bright colors, windows that look out on hope rather than despair. It now serves as a sanctuary for those most in need of healing. There is a certain poetic justice in that, n'est-ce pas?" The weight of understanding. "You seem particularly reflective about this case," I observed, noting the uncharacteristic melancholy in his manner. "Perhaps because it has reminded me of truths I sometimes forget in my pursuit of logical solutions," Poirot replied, rising to stand before the window. "Lady Althea created her own prison, built from bricks of pride and mortar of cruelty. For 23 years, she lived haunted not by supernatural spirits, but by the consequences of her own choices. The weeping woman was never a ghost, Hastings. She was the collective sorrow of a house built on lies." He turned back to face me, his eyes reflecting the afternoon light. "Mrs. Vines weeping for her lost granddaughter, Dorothy weeping for her unknown mother, even Lady Althea weeping for her lost soul. The hotel simply amplified what was already there. Yet something positive emerged from all that tragedy," I pointed out. "Dorothy has found her true identity and chosen to use it constructively." "Exactement. And that is the miracle I spoke of, not locked rooms or impossible crimes, but the resilience of the human spirit. Dorothy Crane is not bitter, she is hopeful. Mrs. Vines is not broken, she is relieved. They have chosen healing over hatred, redemption over revenge." Final revelations. As the afternoon light faded, Poirot returned to his chair with a slight smile playing about his lips. "There is one small confession I must make, mon ami. You recall the blue sequin I claim to have found as evidence? The one from your previous cabaret dancer case? A fabrication, I'm afraid. The sequin actually came from a cheap masquerade mask I discovered in the hotel's attic, part of the costume Dorothy used for her ghost performance. I lied about its origin to protect her dignity while using it to unsettle our true murderer." I stared at him in surprise. "You deliberately misled the investigation?" "I served the greater truth," Poirot corrected gently. "Sometimes justice requires not just the punishment of the guilty, but the protection of the innocent from unnecessary scrutiny. Dorothy had suffered enough without her desperate charade becoming public knowledge. The eternal pattern. This case has taught me something profound about the nature of ghosts." Poirot continued, his accent lending gravity to each word. "People speak of supernatural hauntings, but the most persistent specters are those we create ourselves: guilt, shame, the consequences of our choices. Lady Althea was haunted not by Constance's spirit, but by her own conscience." He straightened his tie with characteristic precision, the gesture signaling his return to his orderly world. "The law concerns itself with facts, His Hastings. Hercule Poirot concerns himself with people. There is a difference, and understanding that difference is what separates mere detection from true comprehension of the human condition." Conclusion. As evening settled over London, I reflected on the complex web of love, betrayal, and redemption we had untangled on those storm-lashed Cornish cliffs. The weeping woman of Blackwood Hotel had been answered at last, not with vengeance, but with compassion, not with continued suffering, but with the possibility of healing. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said, reaching for his hat and coat. "I've heard of a new restaurant where the chef understands the proper preparation of coq au vin. After ghosts and Gothic towers, one requires a reminder that life can still be agreeable." And so we departed into the London evening, leaving behind the shadows of Cornwall, but carrying with us the knowledge that even in the darkest towers of human cruelty, the light of redemption could still find a way to shine through. The affair at the Blackwood Hotel was closed, but its lesson remained that we are defined not by what is done to us, but by what we choose to do in response. That, as Hercule Poirot would say with his characteristic precision, explained everything that truly mattered.